Okay, cool. So now we're going to talk about the ideology of agribusiness for our current issue analysis. So, recently Bayer bought Monsanto, for I think $66 billion, which is a really big sum of money if you think about that, right? Like if I had $66 billion, right?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I would not buy Monsanto.
Yeah, the things I would do, I don't know. Buy Monsanto. Okay, but so that got me thinking, and I thought I would talk a little bit about the ideology that stands behind these agribusinesses. So but in order to do that, we got to take a little trip through history, just a very short one. So starting in the 1960s, the U.S. spearheaded a global agricultural reform that has come to be called the Green Revolution. Over the next few decades, modern farming technologies, including high-yield crop varieties, chemical pesticides and herbicides, synthetic fertilizers, and mechanized irrigation and harvesting systems, were exported throughout the developing world. It is estimated that the Green Revolution prevented as many as 1 billion deaths from starvation. Prevented. Although it's likely that this number is highly exaggerated. One of its main proponents, a guy named Norman Borlaug, won the Nobel Prize for his efforts for the Green Revolution. So superficially, the Green Revolution seems like a great success. The reality, however, as we'll see, is a bit more complicated. It's worth mentioning that altruistic or humanitarian concerns were not the impetus behind the Green Revolution. Rather, Western powers considered agrarian unrest in developing countries a potential source for communist uprisings. Don't forget, this was during the Cold War. And thus, the Green Revolution was, in fact, an attempt to prevent the spread of communism. But I don't want to detract from the accomplishments of the Green Revolution. 1 billion lives saved is worth celebrating, even if it's done for geopolitical self-interest, and even if this number is way exaggerated. I am, however, highly critical of the post-Cold War ideology that resulted from the success of the Green Revolution. And I call this ideology the Feed the World ideology. So the Green Revolution was, from its inception on, a capitalist quote-unquote revolution. And over time, capitalist forms of exploitation have become increasingly apparent and increasingly entrenched in the farming practices of developing economies where the Green Revolution took root. The Feed the World ideology has a very specific model of how agriculture should be done. And this model has had, and continues to have, devastating consequences for the environment, for global food security, and for the communities in the global south to whom it has been exported. So let's talk about this model. Farming, according to the Feed the World ideology, must be first big. Farms have to be big, and the crops grown on them have to be suitable for mass-scale industrial production. So this means rice, wheat, cereals, soy, corn, and sugar. That these are the only crops considered worth growing should immediately raise alarm bells. If it doesn't, try going a month eating only rice, wheat, cereals, soy, corn, and sugar. See how you feel. Together, these are some of the least nutritious foods available. They're staples, and we need them, but we can't survive on them alone, at least not without suffering from chronic malnutrition. Second, farming's produce must be cheap. Again, this seems like a good thing. Cheap food means more people can eat it. But that view is naive and simplistic. Yes, more people purchase these products because they're cheap, but that means more traditional farmers on smaller farms producing more nutritious foods cannot compete. They lose their farms, which in turn are purchased by major agribusinesses. These businesses then migrate production to rice, wheat, cereals, soy, corn, and sugar, thereby lowering the price of these foods further, while driving up the price of more nutritious fruits and vegetables, leading to malnutrition and poverty for the displaced farmers. The effects of this increase in poverty cannot be overemphasized. In India, for example, 30% of the population is involved in agricultural production, 70% of which work on small, labor-intensive farms. That's over 260 million people. As small farms are replaced by large industrial farms, the newly displaced rural poor wreak havoc on local economies. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO, moreover, estimates that 70% of the world's food comes from small farms, while industrial farms produce less than half as much food, but use more than twice the amount of land. These more efficient, smaller farms are replaced, food security therefore becomes a major issue. And when you take into account the fact that there are already over 1 billion malnourished people on the planet, that's almost a seventh of the population, it's clear how harmful the feed the world ideology is. Okay, number 3, oil. In addition to the oil consumed in all the industrial farm machines, in the packaging, in the global shipping and distribution system for agricultural products, which is already enormous, synthetic fertilizer requires huge amounts of natural gas to process. This increases oil consumption, contributes to global warming, and ties food prices to oil prices. So that brings us to the fourth thing that farming must have, according to the Feed the World ideology: chemical pesticides and herbicides, and synthetic fertilizers. So all of these have negative effects on human health and on soil health, and may exacerbate food security issues in the future, especially if world oil reserves begin to diminish. I mean, think about that. The price of food is tied to the price of oil. As soon as oil prices, which are kept artificially low thanks in part to the Saudi efforts to undercut competition, as soon as they rise, many of the world's poorest people, many who were made poor by this feed the world ideology, will no longer be able to afford food. Okay, the fifth and final ideological tenet: feeding the world is a white man's burden. Major capitalist agribusinesses take it as axiomatic that Western farming techniques are superior and must be adopted everywhere. This is not only false, but it's frankly insulting, especially when you consider, as we've already mentioned, that it's the small farms that don't use Western techniques that are producing the great majority of the world's food. Small farms are more efficient, they produce healthier food, they feed more people, they employ more people, and they're more important to the global food system than Western industrial farms. If the feed the world ideology that's characteristic of Monsanto Bayer and other massive agribusinesses like Syngenta continues to determine the course of global agricultural development, then we're all fucked. There is hope, though. In fact, there is a very simple solution. We need to spend every effort to protect and support small farms. And don't just take my word for it. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO, has said the very same thing. In conclusion, high-quality, nutritious food is a human right and should not be left to the vicissitudes of an unaccountable, greed-driven market. And that is our current issue analysis for today.
Thank you very much, Chella. And actually, this is a topic I like very much because I read Michael Pollan a long time ago, and he talks about actually food, and he in a book. And he suggests what we should consider food, in fact, and he addresses many of these issues. And if you look at that list of things that you said, the corn, sugar, wheat,
cereals, soy,
and soy, I mean he basically he pointed out this is 80% of our calories or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And when earlier and maybe as industrial human beings, we eat how many different types of foods, plants and animals. I'm not talking about different pizza or lasagna or something like that. Like, how many different types?
Well, the number has diminished.
It's definitely diminished
as we've entered the industrial era. Yeah.
And it used to be that we got most of our calories from many different types of foods. Yeah. And if we're wondering nowadays why we're so unhealthy, why especially in the United States, why people are becoming more and more obese, maybe the answer is this industrialized food, and it's always been tried to being pushed onto us as if we're lazy and fat and stupid people. And I'm going to say leftists do this quite a bit. We blame conservatives for being fat and lazy and stupid. That's just wrong. It's this industrialized system, right? What would you then? You give this list. As big. It needs to be big. The ideology.
Big,
cheap, oil, chemical pesticides, and what was the last one?
White man's burden.
White man's burden. And so, what would you then suggest, I know this is kind of a topic that you like as well, because you're writing your dissertation about food.
Indeed.
So what would you suggest is that we do?
Well, I mean, I think it's really, supporting the small farms. I mean, there's excellent evidence that small farms produce healthier food and are more efficient, and you can really see it as well, because on a small farm, maybe a family farm that's a couple hectares instead of these massive 100-hectare farms. On a smaller one, the family that's taking care of the farm is really directly connected to the farm. First off, their own livelihood is dependent on the success of the farm, and second off, it's not being done by giant machines. They're in there, they're using their hands, and if they see that something's going wrong with their plants, they can address that issue right away. I mean, you can't do that on a massive farm. It's just too big. If there's a problem, you don't even see that there's a problem until it's already affected 10, 15, 20% of your crop, and at that point, your options are very limited. You either cut down the whole crop and start again, next season, or you just dump an extra load of pesticides or herbicides on the farm in order to hopefully prevent the pest from spreading. Yeah, this doesn't have to be the case with smaller farms. And I'm talking about in the U.S. and our own sort of health problems that we're having, and the fat and the stupid. These fat, stupid conservatives that we talk about all the time. They're also poor. And if there's one group that has been targeted by this sort of industrial farming system, it's been the poor people, because, like I said, the produce from these giant industrial farms is so cheap that poor people can afford it. Right? So there, and it's not just like, oh, we're going to help these poor people by making cheap food for them. It's more like, oh, we know that this is all that they can afford, and there's a lot of them, so we'll market it directly to them. And we do it in very sort of insidious ways. We create this almost this mythology that wealthy, successful people consume these products. That it's the normal way to consume products. Tired, have a Snickers. Right? Why are you tired? Because you've been working all day, man. And where have you been working? In those commercials, you haven't been working in the factory. You've been working in the office all day, running around New York City.
Yeah.
It's slick New York business types that have a Snickers. The fact of the matter is, slick New York business types probably don't have the Snickers. Yeah, but poor people see these advertisements. They're surrounded by them. They're ubiquitous. They make up a very big part of their sort of the cultural memes that they're exposed to, and they think that that's normal. That it's normal for everybody to have a Snickers. That if they want to be a good parent to their children, they got to give their children Snickers sometimes, because otherwise they're failing according to the cultural expectations of eating. Yeah. And that's terrible. I mean, the wealthy people don't eat the Snickers. We just advertise it as though they do, so that poor people eat more of them. And you see this all over the place. And also, another real fun little fact, little tidbit: the soy lobby in the United States recently pressured the government to buy its baby formula and give it to welfare mothers for free. And again, it sounds, oh, that's great. Welfare mothers, they get soy formula for their babies for free. Soy is full of estrogen. Yeah, it's full of hormones. Yeah, it's really, you don't give babies soy formula. It's really bad for babies, man. But you present it as a humanitarian kind of thing. The company says, listen, it's a win-win. The government pays us, and the poor women can feed their babies. Yeah, but they're feeding their babies crap. And that causes developmental problems. And anyway, it's real bad.
Well, I mean, speaking of poor as well, we also make a difference between going with your white man's burden part. We make a difference between poorer countries and wealthier countries. And I was reminded while you were talking about, the statistic that's been going around for the past few months, that global food loss is between 1/3 and 1/2, depending on who you listen to. The 1/3 is, I believe, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. They're the ones who are saying 1/3. The 1/2, the source I found was Huffington Post. So we can debate, which is good, which is not. But what I did, I looked at was the loss is also different, depending on where the people are from. in the countries that are poor, the loss is on the production side. It's the loss at farms and stuff like that. In rich countries, it's on the consumer side, right? It's on the side of restaurants throwing out food just because it looks a little old because they can't sell it that way. Supermarkets throwing food because it's just a weird shape. Or people who I count myself under this too. I feel really bad about wasting food, but I do it sometimes, and it results that people like me waste food at an amount of about 100 kilograms, and for United States people, 220 pounds per person per year in developed countries. And you do urban gardening.
Yep.
Chill. And so the way I connect this, what I think is, would we waste it ourselves if we were producing?
Had we produced it?
How we produced it ourselves? Yeah, that's an excellent point. In my daydreams, I imagine a real kind of green revolution. A real agricultural revolution. And I think agricultural revolutions, including the green revolution to a certain degree, they always kind of come before. Or maybe during some sort of population crisis. Things are going really bad for people. We're not, the population has grown but can't support itself, and then we get some kind of agricultural revolution, and we increase our food production, and then we're able to sort of move forward. And I think that this green revolution was anything but. I think it's actually, in the long run, it's gonna threaten food security more than it helped. It provided some short-term benefits, but I think the long run, it's sent us on just a very toxic trajectory into the future. However, in my daydreams, I like to imagine a real kind of agricultural revolution where we migrate production away from these large-scale mechanized production to smaller scale farms where we employ a lot of people to do the farm work. I even like to imagine. So in my community garden, in my little urban garden, we grow all of our plants in raised beds. In German, Hochbeete, yeah? So we build a little wooden box and we fill it with soil and we grow the plants there, and it's very effective. And, in my imagination, we could have even larger farms, potentially. But instead of growing the crops in the ground, we grow them in raised beds. So, of course, if you have raised beds made out of wood, you can't use big tractors and stuff to harvest or to sow the seeds. You need to use people to do it, but the people wouldn't have to bend over the whole time. Now, farming is intensive, and if you are farming a larger field and you have to bend over the whole time, that's going to be some serious health problems in the future, right? But if you grew your food in these raised beds, then you could avoid or at least mitigate most of those negative side effects, those health side effects. So then in this case, in my imagination, we have farms that are employing a lot of people. So we kind of fix this employment crisis that we're facing. And you can have also, that's something worth talking about. The role of employment and work in the coming years. But at the moment, we're always talking about this employment crisis. Nobody's employed. We also talk about migrant workers, how these migrants are taking our jobs. In my model, there would be so many jobs available to people that, it would almost be like, let the migrants come in, man. We need more people to farm our food, And anyway, it's kind of a half-baked idea. It's just sort of a daydream. But I think that would be, there is the seed of a real agricultural revolution there that increases productivity, that gets us off of these chemical fertilizers and these chemical herbicides, that increases the amount of people that we employ, and also helps to reestablish a connection between everybody and the earth, which I think is extremely valuable, and I think is something that we're missing in our society to a large part. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think. One big point we can make, we've had the biggest demographic shift in just the past 50 years, and that's the shift from farms to cities, right? And these urban gardens are actually a really good way that I think we can make our cities, places where we can actually live. Yeah. Where people can actually, again, now going back to the topics that we were having before, where people can actually start taking things into their own hands.
Yeah, that's right.
Literally, taking their own lives, because food is associated with life. Obviously, we need it to live, and taking food into our own hands.
And also taking the space, because cities, we live in them, but they don't really feel like ours. Everything about the city is planned, by government, groups and boards, behind closed doors. It's developed there. Some of it's beautiful, and sometimes they have really good ideas, and some of it grows up over long periods of time, and but for the most part, it's almost like when you're walking around the city, you're in a kind of museum. You can't really touch anything. I mean, if you're if you're a graffiti artist, you're doing something illegal, but you're also taking back a little bit of that feeling of belonging, in the sense that the city belongs to you. You're saying this is also my space, and I'm going to use it to express myself artistically. And I think the same thing would happen with guerrilla gardening or urban gardening and things like this. I think people would have the opportunity, if there were if there was food everywhere, and people had to take care of it and grow it, and there was and even the city could play the role. The city could build that infrastructure. It's not expensive. It's just wooden boxes filled with soil, and then just leave it up to the people to water and grow food in it. And suddenly that city is not just a place where I walk from home to work, or take the bus, or in the case of the United States, drive my car, but is actually a place where I also grow my food. I really establish roots in that city in both a metaphorical and a literal sense, and I think that would be awesome. So yeah, I appreciate your suggestion, Andrew.
Yeah, it's actually it's funny. It's like one thing that is actually happening in my city, in my home city in Montreal. In a few neighborhoods now, the city has set up at the corner and some intersection of neighborhoods where there's lots of people living, these communal garden, but like it's literally in the city. It's not like we have a park. It's like at the crossroad, like in the middle of the road. And so people plant there. Everybody can just participate. You have like just wooden boards saying like, please put a little bit of water whenever you have time, and take whatever food you can. Just like don't abuse in that thing. But one good thing out of that, it helps people connect. Neighbors are gonna talk to each other and say like, oh yeah, like you see how beautiful this is growing. We're participating together in that thing. It's a communal thing. So it's a pretty interesting experiment that's happening here.
Yeah, that's actually again, I don't like to just keep on plugging this now, but the one-dimensionality things, like it shows that we can actually have a three-dimensional world. A three-dimensional world is, as Chell mentioned, it's something where you're interacting with things. I mean, not just the spray painters and the people doing graffiti and stuff like that, but you yourself. I come from the country. I come from Virginia, the United States. I'm so used to just, picking up sticks and stuff like that, and I don't know, carving them, or, I even have my own garden and stuff like that. And I think a lot of what, city folk are missing, what city people miss, is this interaction with the world on this level. And I think maybe community gardens are one way we can get that back.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. I think then we will end this discussion, and we will take a quick break and then go into our morale.
So this is our morale of the week. So it is my first time here with you guys, and I wanted to maybe do a poem from my own country in my own language. It's a poem by a guy named Gaston Miron, pretty important poet in Quebec, quite separatist. It's the beginning of his biggest, most important poem collection, which is called L'Homme Rapaillé, and this poem is called Liminaire. So I'm going to read it in French, try to give some translation and some context to it afterwards. Liminaire. Pour Emmanuel. J'ai fait de plus loin que moi un voyage abracadabrant. Il y a longtemps que je ne m'étais pas revu. Me voici comme un homme dans une maison, qui s'est faite en son absence. Je te salue, silence. Je ne suis pas revenu pour revenir, je suis arrivé à ce qui commence. So basically, it would go something like that. For Emmanuel, which is the girl he's in love, I made of myself a travel absolutely fantastic. There's been a long time that I haven't seen myself like a man in a house that has been built in his absence. I salute you, silence. I didn't come back to return. I arrived at what begins. So
That's nice.
Very nice.
Yeah.
That's basically it. For myself, there's a lot of way to interpret it, but it tells a lot about like the journey we go through in life, and how the importance of thinking back in what we've been through our journey is the most important thing at the end of the day, not the journey itself, or like the biggest journey is the coming back.
It's remembering back, like thinking back.
Sort of. Yeah.
That's very fitting. I like it actually.
Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah,
it's good.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you
Thanks
very much.
a lot.
You're
Oh, wait.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for clapping.
We're clapping. Yeah, thanks
so
everybody for listening.
Yeah, like and comment and subscribe, I guess.
Yeah, we have a YouTube channel called Propaganda Podcast. We also have a Facebook page called Propaganda Podcast. We have a website called mainstreamidea.com where you can find the Propaganda Podcast. And I think we also have Twitter.
We have Twitter.
Right. Also called Propaganda Podcast.
Isn't it at Propaganda Podcast?
No, it's at Propaganda Pod.
At Propaganda Pod.
Yeah.
Was Propaganda Podcast already taken?
Yeah, it was actually already
That's
taken.
not good, though.
There is actually
There's another Propaganda Podcast.
There's another Propaganda Podcast. And
those bastards.
At least it's leftist. It's one bastard and he's British.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's good.
It's leftist propaganda actually. I don't know if that's his Twitter account. Anyway, thank you for listening, and we'll see each other in 2 weeks because next week we are taking a break. Good night.
Cool. Good night. Thanks. Thanks everybody.
Stay critical.
Stay critical.
Stay compassionate.
And organize.
And organize.